4 months ago, Chelsea thrashed PSG 3-0 in the FIFA Club World Cup final to be crowned, officially, as the champions of world football. Last week, they drew 2-2 against a team from a war-torn Azerbaijani ghost town who have been playing in exile for the last 32 years. Qarabağ FK are a team who few people knew much about when they qualified for the Champions League group stage for the first time in the 2017-18 season. Whipping boys at the time, Qarabağ lost 4-0 and 6-0 against Chelsea and finished bottom of their group. They were derogatorily nicknamed Qarabağ by some English fans, most of whom would struggle to identify Azerbaijan on a map. 8 years on though, Qarabağ cannot be so easily dismissed. The surprise packages of this season's UEFA Champions League, competing in the group or league phase as it is now, for the first time since 2017-18, Qarabağ came back from 2-0 down to beat Benfica 3-2 away from home in their opening game. They beat FC Copenhagen handsomely at home in their second, and they were unfortunate, in matchday 4, to only win 1 point against Chelsea. Qarabağ's only defeat came against Athletic Club, having led within the first minute in Bilbao. Halfway through the league phase, Qarabağ, who have won 11 out of the last 12 Azerbaijan Premier League titles, ranked 15th out of 36 teams, above the likes of Atletico Madrid, Napoli, and Juventus. As things stand, they will advance to the knockout phase playoffs as a seeded club, alongside Borussia Dortmund and Barcelona. It is a world away from where Qarabağ were 32 years ago, when their stadium and hometown were reduced to rubble, 24 years ago, when the club very nearly ceased to exist, or even 8 years ago, when they were battered 10-0 on aggregate by Chelsea, and nicknamed Qarabağ, and it is a rise which few people saw coming. So ahead of games against Napoli, Ajax, Eintracht Frankfurt and Liverpool, which will determine their fate, I figured that it was about time to put an end to my shameful neglect of Azerbaijani football on this channel, which has quite frankly persisted for far too long now, and head 9 hours east of London in an attempt to figure out how a club from a town with a population of 0, in a country which has never qualified for either the World Cup or the Euros, has become, as things stand, the 15th best team in all of Europe. So that's what we're gonna do. So sit back, relax, and join me on a journey from Agdam to Baku, Qarabağ's former and current homes, as we take a look at the rise of the Champions League's ultimate underdogs, the conflict-ridden past which spawned them, and whether their results this season are just the start. Qarabağ are a curious football club, in more ways than one. They were founded in Soviet Azerbaijan's Mersil in 1951, a word which translates from Azerbaijani to English as something like produce, crop or harvest. It is thought that this was because Qarabağ were founded by an association of collectivized local farms and industries, as was common in the USSR. Their stadium in the town of Agdam, the modest Imirat Stadium, opened the following year. Agdam was practically uninhabited at the turn of the 20th century, despite being granted city status in 1828 when the Russian Empire conquered the Caucasus, but its population grew considerably during the Soviet era, peaking, when the USSR collapsed, at close to 30,000 people. Qarabağ never competed in the Soviet top league, though they were a competitive outfit within the Azerbaijan SSR League at times, but following a club record second place finish in the 1968 season, Qarabağ, then Mersil, effectively folded. The club withdrew from the Azerbaijan SSR League before being reborn in 1977 under the name Shafak. They were renamed again in 1982 as the Cooperative Society. Pretty catchy. And it wasn't until 1987 that the club was finally renamed Qarabağ, or Qarabağ Agdam in full. In some senses, this is Qarabağ's modern founding date, and it is telling that the club's badge displays the year 1987, as opposed to 1951 or 1977. It was also around this time that the club began to become a real force within Azerbaijani football. In 1988, Qarabağ won the Azerbaijan SSR League for the first time, which functioned effectively as a regional third tier within the broader Soviet Football League pyramid. Consequently, they were promoted to the Soviet Second League, a 9-division league, which was split up by geographic zones. Qarabağ were assigned to Zone 9 for teams from the Caucasus, but they were relegated in their debut campaign. This is, As you can probably see on screen now, one of the most confusing and dysfunctional leagues and promotion and relegation systems ever to have been devised outside of Argentina. Qarabağ won the Azerbaijan SSR League again in 1990, along with their first ever Azerbaijan SSR Cup, returning to the Soviet Second League, which was by this stage split up into only 3 22-team geographic zones or divisions. Qarabağ all of a sudden were competing with the likes of Zorha Luhansk from Ukraine and Dynamo Brest from Belarus, except, all too often, they wouldn't compete against them at all. On paper, Qarabağ secured an all-time high 11th place finish in the Soviet Second League, but in reality, 11 of their 20 wins, and therefore 22 of their 42 points, had been awarded to them after teams from other Soviet republics refused to travel to Agdam, believing it to be too dangerous. Agdam is located here, in Nagorno-Karabakh, a historically majority ethnic Armenian enclave in the west of Azerbaijan. Nagorno-Karabakh is part of the wider region of Qarabağ, which spans territory in both Azerbaijan and Armenia, and from which Qarabağ take their name. Nagorno-Karabakh was once one of 15 provinces of the Armenian Kingdom, and Armenian culture and civilization flourished here during the early Middle Ages. Conquered by Muslims in the mid-7th century, within a couple of hundred years, it is believed that an Armenian revolt had led to Nagorno-Karabakh being governed as an independent or at least semi-autonomous principality. Fast forward past the Ottoman, Qajar and Persian eras, and Qarabağ fell into Russian hands following the Russian Empire's victory in the Russo-Persian War in 1813. At this time, the population of Nagorno-Karabakh was roughly 90% ethnic Armenian. Following the 1917 Russian Revolution, Nagorno-Karabakh was incorporated into the newly formed Transcaucasian Democratic Federative Republic, which lasted for all of about 5 weeks before Georgia declared independence, followed shortly by Armenia and Azerbaijan. Stay with me here. I promise you this is all relevant to how Qarabağ drew 2-2 with Chelsea, and I'm not even joking. The October Revolution occurred during World War I, in which the Ottomans, with the support of the German Empire, Georgia and Azerbaijan, fought the Russians, who had the support of the British Empire and Armenia. This was the theatre of war that witnessed the Armenian genocide, in which between 600,000 to 1.5 million Armenians were killed, and 2,000 years of Armenian civilization in eastern Anatolia was destroyed. The Russians held the strategic advantage throughout most of World War I, and there were plans to capture Ottoman Iraq before the Bolshevik Revolution. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, though, which ended Soviet Russia's involvement in World War I, conceded parts of the Transcaucasus to the Ottomans, with the short-lived Transcaucasian Democratic Federative Republic established to defend the region against an impending Ottoman invasion. The diverging goals of the Armenians, Georgians, and the Azerbaijanis, then known predominantly as Tatars, led to the creation of 3 independent states instead. This was unsurprising, as conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan in regions with mixed Armenian and Azerbaijani populations, including Nagorno-Karabakh, had already broken out in the final months of World War I. Following Ottoman defeat at the end of World War I, the British occupied Qarabağ. We were bound to at some point, weren't we? With David Lloyd George's government voicing support for Azerbaijani rule over the region. This was, again, unsurprisingly, opposed by Qarabağ Armenians, causing an outbreak of guerrilla warfare. Guerrilla warfare refers to a war fought by small groups of irregular soldiers against typically larger regular forces, and not, I repeat, not a war fought by actual guerrillas, just in case there are any thick people watching. I don't want to get into that age-old debate again of who'd win in a fight between 100 Armenian men and a guerrilla. While all of this was going on, the Red Army invaded Azerbaijan, overthrew the independent Azerbaijan Democratic Republic government, and established the Azerbaijan Soviet Socialist Republic, all in the space of 2 weeks. Before the end of 1920, the Soviets had also invaded Armenia, overthrown the Armenian government, and established the Armenian Soviet Socialist Republic, this time in only 5 days. The Soviet solution to the Armenian-Azerbaijani conflict over the territories of Nagorno-Karabakh was to keep the region under Azerbaijani jurisdiction, but just 3 years later, Also, to establish the Qarabağ Autonomous Region. The borders of the Qarabağ Autonomous Region were drawn so as to include as many majority Armenian towns and villages as possible, and as few Azerbaijani ones, resulting in a 94% majority ethnic Armenian population. Despite the region being nominally autonomous, Armenian culture and identity were heavily suppressed throughout the Soviet era, and the Azerbaijan SSR encouraged Azerbaijanis to move in and resettle there. Nonetheless, actual conflict died down for several decades following Soviet takeover, only rearing its head again when the imminent collapse of the USSR became obvious in the late 1980s. The prospect of Nagorno-Karabakh falling into the hands of an independent Azerbaijan was a dreadful one, as far as many Armenians were concerned. So, with the support of the Armenian SSR, the still majority local Qarabağ Armenian population launched a campaign for Nagorno-Karabakh to be transferred to the Armenian SSR in 1987. Moscow rejected their demands, but as the Soviets' grip on power dissipated, this did little to cool local tensions. Several flashpoints between protesters and the police, most notably the Askaran clash, led to the outbreak of the First Nagorno-Karabakh War in February 1988. When Nagorno-Karabakh's National Council proclaimed the unification of Nagorno-Karabakh and the Armenian SSR, the Azerbaijan Soviet Socialist Republic abolished Nagorno-Karabakh's autonomous status entirely, bringing the territory under direct Azerbaijani control. Armenians responded by holding a referendum on creating an independent state in Nagorno-Karabakh, which received 99.8% approval. Local Azerbaijanis boycotted the referendum, but due to the significant Armenian majority population, 108,736 out of 132,328 citizens eligible to vote still did so. In 1991, both Armenia and Azerbaijan gained independence from the dissolving Soviet Union, and both the tensions and the violence in Nagorno-Karabakh intensified. Azerbaijan enlisted the help of significant numbers of Afghan Mujahideen soldiers, who were free to help now that the Soviets had withdrawn from Afghanistan, along with a number of Chechen fighters. Russia provided Armenia with tanks and artillery, and mercenaries fought on both sides. Within 3 years, over 30,000 people were dead, over half of them civilians. Throughout this period, incredibly, Qarabağ continued to play games in their hometown of Agdam. It was only in 1993, when Armenian forces captured the town and its entire population fled eastwards towards Azerbaijan's major cities, that Qarabağ did likewise. From a population of almost 30,000 in the final Soviet census in 1989, the population of Agdam fell to 0. The entire town, including Qarabağ's Emirat Stadium, were reduced to rubble, earning Agdam the nickname the Hiroshima of the Caucasus. It's an unfortunate nickname, isn't it? You don't really want to be described as the Hiroshima of anything, I find. Qarabağ were not only exiled, like tens of thousands of Azerbaijanis, their manager was killed during the defense of the town. Aleveri Bagirov was a seminal figure in the history of Qarabağ. When the club refounded in 1977, he was their first manager, aged only 31 at the time. He held the role for the next 15 years, including Qarabağ's 2 Azerbaijan SSR League and Azerbaijan SSR Cup triumphs, until his death in 1992. When the war broke out in 1988, Bagirov volunteered in the Azerbaijani army. He created his own battalion, which he commanded jointly with his brother Eldar, who also played for Qarabağ as a defender, and solely after Eldar died in 1991. During the Kajoli massacre, which was one of the worst atrocities of the war, Bagirov was credited with saving hundreds of Azerbaijani lives by exchanging captives and bodies with the Armenians. On June 12, 1992, after Bagirov's battalion had captured 5 villages, an anti-tank mine blew up the vehicle that he and 4 others were travelling in. Bagirov was killed, age 46, and posthumously recognised as a national hero of Azerbaijan. Qarabağ, meanwhile, were left with no stadium, no town, and no manager. They became a team of nomads, playing at various stadiums, before settling in Baku. Nonetheless, Qarabağ were not only founding members of Azerbaijan's newly formed independent Azerbaijan Top League, they won the league in its inaugural season, along with the Azerbaijan Cup. Future successes would prove harder to come by. Despite remaining highly competitive, by the end of the 1990s, Qarabağ were in serious financial trouble. They finished third from bottom in the 2000 to 2001 season, and it looked at that stage as though the club could go out of business. It was at this point that the Azerbaijani government stepped in. At this time, Nagorno-Karabakh was still officially part of Azerbaijan and internationally recognised as such, but it was controlled by the unrecognised Republic of Artsakh, which received Armenian support, but not recognition. Azerbaijan's president Haydar Aliyev and those around him reportedly, and very shrewdly, determined that having a competitive Azerbaijani football club bearing the name of the disputed territory, namely Qarabağ, would cement the idea that Qarabağ was Azerbaijani rather than Armenian. When one thinks, with the benefit of hindsight, that Qarabağ have since travelled to major European capitals like Rome, London and Madrid, flying the Azerbaijani flag, the premise proved to be correct. In 2001, Azersun Holding, one of Azerbaijan's largest conglomerates, became Qarabağ's main sponsors and ultimately their owners. For a time, the club was even renamed Qarabağ Azersun, though they reverted solely to Qarabağ in 2004. Suddenly, money was no longer a problem. There were one or two other problems though. In the 2002-03 season, for example, in which Qarabağ had targeted a title challenge, the Azerbaijan Top League was cancelled. A conflict between the Association of Football Federations of Azerbaijan and Azerbaijan Top League clubs resulted in clubs refusing to fulfill fixtures. Multiple clubs accused AFFA president Fawad Musayev of financial mismanagement, and UEFA issued Azerbaijan with a 2-year suspension owing to the mess. When the championship returned in 2003-04, Qarabağ finished third. Whereas most of Azerbaijan's top teams at the time, like Neftchi and FC Baku, invested heavily in bringing overseas players to Azerbaijan, Qarabağ attempted to cement their Azerbaijani identity around a core of domestic players. There was a concerted effort, backed by recently deceased Azersun president Abdulbari Gürzel, to bring Azerbaijan's best players to the club, so much so that, at one stage, practically half of the Azerbaijan squad played their club football for Qarabağ. Even Azerbaijan's most recent squad featured 7 Qarabağ players. In 2008, following a disappointing 5th place finish in the newly rebranded Azerbaijan Premier League, Qarabağ appointed Azerbaijan legend Gurbanov as their new head coach. The national team's all-time leading goal scorer, until 2025, Gurbanov still manages Qarabağ now, over 15 years on. Qarabağ appointed Gurbanov in the same summer that Barcelona appointed Pep Guardiola, and during his early years at the club, several comparisons were drawn between the two. Gurbanov was credited with bringing tiki-taka to Azerbaijan, so much so that Qarabağ were nicknamed the Barcelona of the Caucasus. Qarabağ won the Azerbaijan Cup in Gurbanov's debut campaign, but in the league, they would have to wait until the 2013-14 season to win their second league title, and their first since the first season of independent Azerbaijani football in 1993. Whilst league success wouldn't be instant, it would be emphatic. Since 2013-14, Qarabağ have won all but one Azerbaijan Premier League title, becoming one of the most domestically dominant football clubs on the planet. In Europe, Gurbanov oversaw gradual progression. Historic victories against the likes of Rosenborg, Wisla Krakow and Red Bull Salzburg were all viewed as landmark moments not only for the club themselves, but for Azerbaijani football as a whole. Whilst some fans mocked Qarabağ's heavy defeats against Chelsea in the 2017-18 season, qualification for the Champions League group stage was a monumental achievement, and Gurbanov's men earned back-to-back draws against Atletico Madrid, who went on to lift the Europa League under Diego Simeone that season. Perhaps a little bit of Simeone rubbed off on Gurbanov, who has become less dogmatic in his adherence to patient build-up play and intricate passing moves over the years. Like a lot of clubs outside of Europe's major leagues, Qarabağ have to contest with being flat-track bullies domestically, where they are expected to dominate and win almost every game, but rank outsiders and complete underdogs in Europe, where they face teams with budgets multiple times their own, and where they are expected to see far, far less of the ball. As anyone who has watched Qarabağ in this season's Champions League will know, they are a completely different beast in Europe now. Qarabağ, who have also compromised to a degree on their emphasis on signing Azerbaijani players, with one of the most cosmopolitan squads in this season's Champions League, featuring players from 14 different nationalities, play with an incredibly high intensity, they look to win turnovers in dangerous areas, and they are fantastic at turning attacks and counter-attacks into shooting opportunities. One thing that Enzo Maresca remarked upon before facing Qarabağ was that they play with such a clear sign of identity and understanding, which makes sense given that they have had the same manager for the last 17 years, and Qarabağ's assistant, Mushfiq Husinov, was born in Agdam and played for the club when they went into exile in the early 90s. This was a gradual process, with the UEFA Conference League providing Qarabağ with invaluable experience. Following bruising Champions League and Europa League group stage campaigns, Qarabağ only lost one of their 6 Conference League group matches, beating Ammonia and Kairat to progress to the knockout round playoffs, where they were well beaten by Marseille. What's more, Qarabağ's increased domestic dominance has allowed them to turn virtually all of their attention to Europe. Over the last 2 seasons, they have won the league by 15 and 25 points, meaning that they can often afford to rest or rotate players ahead of European fixtures. The AFFA are also rather generous in this regard, with Qarabağ rarely facing fixture congestion ahead of European matches. Their opening game this season was postponed, since it fell just a couple of days before Qarabağ's crucial Champions League league phase playoff first leg against Ferencváros, which they won 3-1 away from home, and they had a full week's rest ahead of their last 2 Champions League fixtures against Chelsea and Athletic Club. Recruitment has also been key. Colombian forward Camilo Duran joined Qarabağ from Portuguese outfit Portimonense in the summer, before scoring and assisting in Qarabağ's Champions League comeback win away at Benfica, winning the Man of the Match award on his Champions League debut. Against Chelsea, Duran bullied 19-year-old Joral Hato and repeatedly exploited his and Tosin Adarabio's unfamiliar centre-back partnership. Cady Borges, who is one of 4 Brazilians at Qarabağ, is now in his second stint with the club, having rejoined them over the summer from Champions League league phase playoff opponents Ferencváros. The Azerbaijan Premier League's top scorer in his final season before departing, Borges has immediately returned to being one of the team's primary creative forces. On the opposite flank, Frenchman Abdelazoube is now in his 8th season with the club, having arrived from Lens in 2018, and his energy, invention and end products will see him go down as one of Qarabağ's greatest ever players. The Qarabağ player who has got more people talking than anyone else, though, is Leandro Andrade. A Portuguese-born Cape Verde international, Andrade joined Qarabağ from Bulgarian outfit Cherno Mor in 2022. Sharing a name with one of the greatest footballers to have ever lived, Uruguay's Jose Leandro Andrade, Qarabağ's Andrade has caught the eye with his quick feet, sharp eye for a pass, and, increasingly, his incredibly useful habit of scoring goals. Andrade scored 17 goals and made 10 assists in all competitions last season, and he has scored in 3 of Qarabağ's 4 Champions League league phase matches so far this season, against Benfica, Athletic Club, and most recently Chelsea, leading to talk of interest from bigger leagues around Europe. In the summer just gone, Qarabağ sold Brazilian forward Juninho, who they signed for a reported €450,000, for a reported club record €5 million, to Brazilian giants Flamengo. Further sales, though painful, would be a sign of the club's success. This is an advert brought to you by me. A lot of people stop me in the street and say, "Wow, it's Alfie Potsama. You're the best football YouTuber in the world, and somehow even more handsome in real life than online. Please may I have your autograph, take a photo, and sleep with you?" And I have to say, look, I'm very sorry, that is awfully kind of you, but I do have a girlfriend. The other thing that they often say, I mean, almost always really, is there any way that I can get more of you? Is there perhaps a second channel of yours that I could subscribe to where you make to-camera documentaries about various interesting topics? And I say, Yes, it's called the Alfie Potsdamer YouTube channel, and funnily enough, I just uploaded my latest video there about the Basque derby between Real Sociedad and Athletic Club, the history of Basque sport and culture, and why that game is so unique among major football rivalries. I know, it sounds fascinating, and it is, which is why I am advertising it to you now. No payments were made in exchange for this advert. HITC Sevens and Alfie Potsdamer are the same person. T's and C's apply. Now back to the video. There are both romantic and cynical reasons behind Qarabağ's undoubtedly remarkable rise. The club was rehabilitated, when others most likely wouldn't have been. It is not exactly uncommon for Azerbaijani clubs to be dissolved because of their symbolism. Due to their 1993 exile, Qarabağ became known in Azerbaijan as the refugee club. Nigel Farage can't stand them. As a result, Qarabağ don't just draw their support from their former home of Agdam, not least because there is basically no one there anymore, nor their new home of Baku, but throughout the whole of Azerbaijan, and especially among Azerbaijani refugees. To many, Qarabağ have come to represent national pride, resistance to Armenia, and Azerbaijan's claim to the region. As tends to be the case with nationalism, especially when it flirts dangerously close to ultranationalism, this isn't always entirely benevolent. Throughout the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, which has now spanned for almost 4 decades, atrocities have been carried out on both sides. Armenians massacred Azerbaijanis in Kajoli, then Azerbaijanis massacred Armenians in Maraga. These were seen as tit-for-tat atrocities as the cruelty and bloodshed intensified in a senseless waste of life. In October 2020, shortly after the Second Nagorno-Karabakh War, yes, there was another one, Qarabağ's PR and social media manager, Nurlan Ibrahimov, posted on social media, quote, "Kill all the Armenians, old and young, without distinction." End quote. The Armenian Football Federation called for sanctions against Qarabağ, and UEFA temporarily suspended Ibrahimov from all football-related activities and fined the club €100,000. Azerbaijan is a dictatorship which has been ruled by Ilham Aliyev since 2003, when he succeeded his father Haydar Aliyev as president shortly before his death. Haydar, who was a high-ranking KGB official, first governed Soviet Azerbaijan from 1969 to 1982, before becoming first deputy premier of the USSR. He was installed as president of an independent Azerbaijan following a military coup in 1993, after which he established what critics described as an authoritarian police state. When Haydar fell ill, Ilham was appointed as prime minister. 2 months later, when his father died, he became president. In Azerbaijan's 2003 presidential elections, Ilham won a stonking 76.84% of the votes. After opponents were arrested, journalists were persecuted, and widespread fraud and abuse, as documented by Human Rights Watch and the Institute for Democracy in Eastern Europe. Hey, at the end of the day, I always say, it's not about how you win an election, it's just all about winning it. Ilham has ruled Azerbaijan for the last 22 years with an iron fist. Freedom House gave Azerbaijan's political rights a score of 0 out of 40, not great, and their civil liberty 7 out of 60 in their Freedom Index, ranking Azerbaijan as the 15th least free country in the entire world, sandwiched right between Afghanistan, slightly more free, and Tajikistan, slightly less free. Freedom House reports that, quote, "Corruption is rampant, and the formal political opposition has been weakened by years of persecution." End quote. Slightly less free than Afghanistan under Taliban rule is never a great sign, is it? Ilham held a referendum to abolish presidential term limits in 2009, allowing him to become president for life, which received emphatic, roughly 90% support from the public, but which some international observers and naysayers described as being, quote, marred by fraud. Aliyev won Azerbaijan's last presidential election in 2024, securing himself a 5th term with a remarkable 92% of the vote, during an election campaign in which his closest opponent, Zahid Oruj, said that he endorsed the current government and encouraged his supporters to vote for Aliyev rather than him. Fantastic stuff. In an effort to improve Azerbaijan's image and avoid becoming an international pariah, Aliyev's government has invested heavily in sports. The term sports washing is actually believed to have been coined to describe Azerbaijan's hosting of the inaugural European Games in 2015, which drew criticism from Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch. Most European heads of state boycotted the Games, with the notable exceptions of Vladimir Putin, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, Alexander Lukashenko, Boyko Borisov, and Viktor Ponta, which, incidentally, just so happens to also be my answer to the question, if you could have any 5 guests at your dream dinner party, who would you pick? Since the 2015 European Games, Azerbaijan has also hosted the 2016 Under-17 Euros, the 2019 Europa League final, much to the chagrin of Arsenal and Chelsea supporters, 3 group games and a quarter-final at Euro 2020, and 9 Formula 1 Grand Prix, having become part of the F1 circuit in 2017. Azerbaijan's increased hosting of UEFA events came after SOCAR, the state oil company of the Republic of Azerbaijan, became an official sponsor of UEFA national team competitions in 2013, ahead of Euro 2016. The Baku Olympic Stadium, built specifically to host these kinds of showpiece events, costs more than $600 million and has a maximum capacity of 69,870. The state oil company of the Republic of Azerbaijan also owns Neftchi, Azerbaijan's biggest and second most successful club, behind Qarabağ. In the second half of the 2012-13 and in both the 2013-14 and 2014-15 seasons, Azerbaijan were the main sponsors of Atletico Madrid, whose staff and players travelled to Azerbaijan in 2013, with Atleti agreeing to train Azerbaijani footballers in both Madrid and in Baku, at a time when Azerbaijani businessman Hafiz Mammadov owned shares in the club. Mammadov also previously owned FC Baku and RC Lens, the latter of whom were also sponsored by the Azerbaijani state during the mid-2010s, and he launched a failed takeover attempt at Sheffield Wednesday in 2014. To be clear, none of this is to diminish the achievements of Qarabağ staff and players, or to strip the club's progress and achievements of any romance and mysticism. Qarabağ's story of exile, borderline extinction, and now rivaling Europe's elite within 7 years of being whipping boys, all with either the 3rd or 4th lowest wage bill in the competition, is remarkable, even with the external factors acting upon it taken into account. You may recall, a little earlier on, I slipped in quite casually that there was a second Nagorno-Karabakh war. That kicked off in September 2020, when Azerbaijan, with Turkish support, launched an offensive on the line of contact, which was established following the 1994 ceasefire and separated Armenian and Azerbaijani forces. When a ceasefire was agreed following a month of hostilities, Azerbaijan had made significant territorial gains, capturing approximately 1/3 of Nagorno-Karabakh, previously governed by the unrecognized Republic of Artsakh, including the region's second largest city Shusha and all surrounding territories. Azerbaijan violated the ceasefire 3 years later, when they exploited Russian weakness and preoccupation in Ukraine to launch a major offensive on the de facto independent republic in September 2023. When the Republic of Artsakh surrendered and Azerbaijan captured the region, virtually the entire population of Nagorno-Karabakh, constituting roughly 100,000 people, fearing starvation, fled to Armenia through the Lachin corridor in what Armenia described as an act of ethnic cleansing. Now all of Nagorno-Karabakh's football clubs, most notably Lanayan Artsakh, who were formerly known as Qarabağ, are also in exile, and their staff and players also made refugees. Their stadium, the Stepanakert Republican Stadium, previously the Joseph Stalin Stadium, and since renamed the Kankendi Stadium, was refurbished by Azerbaijani authorities, and in December 2023, FK Qarabağ hosted Moik Baku there for their first game in Nagorno-Karabakh in over 30 years. Photographs of Azerbaijan's president Ilham Aliyev and his father Haydar Aliyev now line the deserted streets of Nagorno-Karabakh. Lanayan Artsakh compete in the Armenian First League, despite being a club without a permanent home. Perhaps the Armenian government will rescue them, a wealthy Armenian conglomerate with government ties will invest in them, and one day they'll be drawing 2-2 against Chelsea, 100 miles away from home. The Emirat Stadium, Qarabağ's old home which was destroyed by Armenians 3 decades ago, is set to be fully rebuilt as a modern 11,700 capacity UEFA Category 4 ground. Ilham Aliyev visited the stadium site in 2024 and laid the foundational stone for its construction. The prospect of Qarabağ returning to Agdam has been much discussed, but it remains a distant one. Plans to reconstruct and repopulate the town with 100,000 Azerbaijanis were announced by Aliyev in 2021, but that is easier said than done. Nagorno-Karabakh is not only a metaphorical minefield but a literal one, and it is anticipated that it could take up to 15 years just to clear Agdam of the town's last remaining landmines. A brand new club, Qarabağ FC, who were founded in 2024 and joined the 4th tier of Azerbaijani football, are scheduled to become the region's first professional Azerbaijani club since the 1990s. They currently play in Shemaki, with plans in place to move into a renovated Qarabağ stadium following Lanayın Artsak's Exile in the near future. Qarabağ FK face Napoli at the end of this month in their next Champions League game. Victory could take them ahead of PSG, Liverpool and Real Madrid. That is it for today's video, but thank you all very much as ever for watching. Hit the like button if you enjoyed it or found it remotely interesting or informative. Let me know your thoughts down below in the comments. And of course, make sure that you are subscribed and have notifications turned on, not just for this channel, HITC Sevens, but also just as, if not even more importantly, my second or sister channel, Alfie Potsama, both of which should be about to appear on your screens now, along with a couple of videos that you might enjoy watching after this one. You can also find me on various social media platforms, should you wish to do so, typically via the username at HITC Sevens, and you can also support my work additionally now, should you be feeling especially generous, either via the Alfie Potsama YouTube channel, where you can become a channel member, or via buymeacoffee.com/Alfie Potsama, where you can do likewise, become a channel member that is, but Google won't take 30% of it, which is, always nice. Anyway, I hope to see you very shortly. Take care out there until then. I love you all very much. Cheers.